John chapter 9. If you would, John chapter 9. In just a minute, we're going to be reading in verse 1. John chapter 9 and verse 1. The story in John chapter 9 is the story of Jesus healing someone who is blind. They receive their sight. And there are several of these stories in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, only one in John. It's long, takes 41 verses here, although the actual healing is only 7 verses. Verses 8 through 41 tell about the after effects, what happened as a result. And all of this is important because in John, as you know, there are no miracles. John doesn't use that word. There are miraculous signs, however. And Jesus does incredible things, but they're pointing to truths. And so this particular miracle sign here really is representative of that truth. There are so many theological and biblical truths embedded in this story of Jesus healing this blind man and giving him sight. And so let's read the first verse, and what I want to do this morning is simply walk through the entire passage instead of giving you the structure up front, and then at the end we'll back up and look over the passage and try to see how there's meaning at the structural level, how the structure of how John arranges this story actually teaches us something. And so look at verse 1. This is John chapter 9, verse 1. As he, speaking of Jesus, passed by, he saw a blind man from birth, a man blind from birth. Now, a couple of ironic things in there. There's lots of irony in this chapter. The first of all, that Jesus saw him. And of course, this is a picture of salvation. This man was not healed because he saw Jesus. He was healed because Jesus saw him. And he was blind from birth. Now, I read this, I assume it to be true this week, that if someone's blind from birth, they don't have dreams that have pictures in them. They could have dreams where they could feel like they're hearing things, of course, but they don't have any idea of what images were like. And it's certainly true that this man never dreamed of seeing. He never dreamed of anything like this experience he's about to experience. But before Jesus does that, his disciples give him a loaded theological question. Look at verse 2. And his disciple asked him, Rabbi, it's teacher. So in other words, Jesus, put on your teaching hat. We have a question for you. Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? So they may have been thinking about Exodus chapter 20, verse 5, that says this, I am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. So in other words, if these people genuinely had sinned, maybe even though he could not have done anything because he was in utero, in the womb, still his parents' sin was passed on to him. And of course, it's bad logic. It's the logic of legalism that says that if you have something wrong with you, God must be mad at you. But the reason why that logic is so bad is kind of easy to come to. You can then imagine just by force of logic that everyone who is healthy God is pleased with. That's certainly not the case, is it? So the health that we receive or the challenges to our health that we receive are not indicators of the grace of God in our life. Jesus has to correct this legalistic type of thinking. And so here he does it in verse 3. Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. A night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. So Jesus is the light of the world. However, his existence, his incarnation, flesh, walking around in the earth is going to be for a limited amount of time. And Jesus said it's a metaphor for day and night. As long as it's daytime, I'm here. We have to get busy doing these works. So it's a reminder that God has specific tasks as believers that he wants us to accomplish. So all of grace, we see that in verses 1 and 2, but that grace leads us to do things, to do these works, Jesus said, that they had to do as disciples. But notice he says that the reason why this man was born blind, so that the works, plural, of God might be displayed in him. Which makes us think that what this man is about to experience, receiving his sight, is bigger than receiving sight. There's something we need to learn from this story. The works, plural, of God are going to be displayed in this man's life. So look at verse 6. Here's what happens. Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud. So anointed can mean two things. It can mean to rub, old Hebrew word. It can also mean to choose. So someone is anointed. They're chosen by God. Jesus is Christ. He's the chosen one. But he anointed these man's eyes with mud and said to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. Well, it's a phenomenal story, and every story has a rising tension, a release of tension, and an ending, and we've already seen all that in the verse 7 verses, so obviously there's much more that John wants us to understand about the story since it ends just here in verse 7. But before we move on with the rest of the story, we have to ask this question: why did Jesus make this mud? It reminds us of the way of Jesus. Jesus is always performing miracles, but he's not doing it with any sensationalism. Have you noticed this? So you see a movie portrayed where something does something miraculous. Jesus is not a genie in the bottle where there's glitter and fireworks and great effort displayed. He's not trying to draw any attention to himself. He's trying to draw attention to the Father. Most every time Jesus performs a miracle, it's always done in some subtle way, but it's done in a way that's intended to communicate. So again, why did he make this mud? Well, the answer is we don't know. If we wanted to know more, Jesus could have told us through John exactly why he did it, but it does remind us of something. Jesus created something with the dirt and with the saliva that didn't previously exist. And it reminds us of a huge theme in John, and that is that Jesus is the creator. So going back to John chapter 1 and verse 3, all things were made through him, and without him was not anything that was made. So everything that was made is something that is made by Jesus. And so maybe what Jesus is doing here is he's taking this dirt and reminding us that man is made from dirt. He's taking the saliva, minus the fact that Jesus Christ is God as a man, and he's mixing them together and he's putting on his eyes to remind him of this truth, that if he could create all things, surely he could give this man sight. You know this, but the sun, the source of all light on our planet, is so large that if it was hollow, you could put 1 million Earths inside of it. Now just think about that, 1 million Earths. So from coast to coast, if you go from California to the Carolinas, is about 3,000 miles, roughly 3,000 miles. But to do the same thing across the surface of the sun, it's about 860,000 miles. You just can't even conceive of how large that is. Which is not the remarkable thing. The remarkable thing is that the sun is not the largest star that we know of. In fact, there are other stars called hypergiants, maybe you know this, one of which they've measured is over 1,400,000,000 miles across. That's a dramatic pause, but it's not long enough for us to wrap our minds around. We don't even calculate, we have no frame of reference. Oh yeah, 1 billion miles, I've done that. No, there's no frame of reference for that. It's just overwhelming. So maybe what Jesus is doing is saying, look, if I can create all things that have ever produced light, don't you think I can take 2 little retinae and cornea and start making them work again? Now, let me diverge a little bit and then we'll come back. One of the great things that we love as Americans is great success stories. And to us, there's probably no greater success story when someone starts out really small and then they do something big. So I think of Bill Gates, who starts off in his garage, right, doing whatever he did in his garage, and now he's a billionaire. Or a story I like even better, Harlan Sanders, who had always tinkered around with food and tinkered around with hotels and with restaurants, but he owned a gas station at one point and served fried chicken. He figured out a way to pressure fried chicken, and then in his 70s, he figured out how to make this business, here's the word, scalable. That's the word we use, scalable, which means it was small, but inherent within that organization was a means by which the small could become large. And he died inventing Kentucky Fried Chicken and the franchise, and was a multimillionaire when he passed away. It was scalable. But when we use the word scalable, we always mean from the small to the big, right? We don't take a guy who had $1 million business and went bankrupt and said, that business was really scalable. He took it down to nothing. He scaled down. Now, when we use the word scalable, we always mean it scales up, right? Anything that's successful, we would say it had this propensity, something was embedded inside the organizational structure that didn't cap it, right? It could grow, it could be scalable to something larger. That applies to everything, but never to God. Because God can't scale up, right? He's God. God aspires to nothing. God can't grow. He is self-contained, like the burning bush. He's a fire that doesn't need fuel to keep it sustained. He's totally self-contained in and of himself. He can't scale up. So, in order for God to reach us, he must, in that sense, scale down. This is the argument that Jeremiah used in Jeremiah 32. Listen to this, Jeremiah 32 and verse 17. Ah, Lord God, it is you who have made the heavens and the earth by your great power and by your outstretched arm. Nothing is too difficult for you. In other words, the argument is from the macro to the micro. God is so large that he demonstrates his godness, not in demonstrating just how large he is, by demonstrating the fact that although he created everything, he can enter into the details of our situation. This is a remarkable thought. And so, here's the question I think this text is forcing us right up front. I want you to think about this. If we could grasp this one truth, it really is revolutionary. How small do you need God to be? Our prayer lives reflect this. How small do we need God to be? For some of us, we're going to have great music today, have a great day, but there's nothing more pressing on your mind right now than your granddaughter's heart. She's not given her life to Christ yet. And the God who made everything, all things, what you need is for him to be that right there, the God who will lead her in conviction to brokenness to come to find faith in Christ. For some, it's a child that's away from God. Others, it's a financial pressure. Others, it's a situation pressing on us that we can't seem to find resolution in. And our tendency is to think, well, you know what, I don't want to bother God. God needs to be concerned with bigger things. Listen very carefully. This is so important. If you grasp this, listen. Everything is a small thing to God. If I were to bring a 7'2" NBA player and ask you the question, which would be harder for him to beat in basketball, a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old? You'd say, Pastor, that's a silly question. Right. Listen, the difference between the 1-year-old and the 2-year-old is the difference between your problem and the big worldwide problems. Since all things are small to God compared to God, everything that is big to you, therefore, is big to God. It's equally important. And while you expect me to say it, of course, this is why what we're talking about prayer is so important, because prayer is the recognition of that. That God is glorified in us just like he's glorified in this blind man receiving sight. When we say, God, would you please scale down into this situation? And the spit on the ground helps us understand this. Because the reason why there was spit on the ground is because God became a man. There's no greater sign of God's willingness, ability, and desire to intervene in the affairs of your life than he, God, came in the form of an infant, lived a life as a man, and died on a cross to intervene the wrath of God on our behalf and rose from the dead. The events of the life of Christ are a living testimony to the fact that God can scale down exactly to our situation. So when Mary had been told by the angel, by the way, you've never been with a man, but you're going to have a baby, she simply replied, well, nothing is impossible with God. That simple faith was the catalyst for everything God was going to do, humanly speaking, through the gospel. And by the way, Mary, maybe you know this, was actually quoting Genesis chapter 18 when Abraham was telling his wife Sarah, both in their 90s, that they were going to have a baby. And Sarah was laughing, and Abraham simply said, look, I don't pretend to understand it, but nothing is impossible for God. And since we know that nothing is impossible for God, and since we know that God does want to be pursued, imagine if you and if I, as people of faith, pursued God and said, God, since nothing is impossible to you, would you intervene in my situation, in my life? How small do you need God to be? Well, it's a remarkable story. But it leads us to the question, why did John, in this remarkable story, only include that in 7 verses? Why do verses 8 through 41 exist? Why is there so much after this? What follows with this poor guy who's just been healed is incredible interrogations. He's interrogated 5 times. He's interrogated once by his neighbors, then by the Pharisees, his parents by the Pharisees, he again by the Pharisees, and then finally he's interrogated by Jesus himself. So again, let's read through the story, then we'll come back and see the structure that's in the story. Here's what happens next, verse 8. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, is this not the man who used to sit and beg? Some said, it is he. Others said, no, but he is like him. He kept saying, I am the man. Of course, they didn't believe him. So they said to him, then how are your eyes open? And he answered, the man. He doesn't know who he is. This is the base of his theological knowledge. There was just a man. He doesn't know how to visualize this. He's never dreamed of this. The man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed and received my sight. They said to him, where is he? He said, I do not know. He's healed, but he's certainly no theologian, right? Who healed you? I don't know. The man. Where is he? I can't tell you that. All I can tell you is that I can see. But it's interesting, even in his simplicity, he is already symbolic of the work of Christ. Do you know what he said? Look what he said back in verse 10. He said, I am the man, which reminds us back up in chapter 8 when Jesus said, verse 58, truly, truly, I say before Abraham was, I am. There might be a connection there because after all, he sent him to the pool of Siloam, and we learn that that word means sent. So the sent one from God is now sending another one to be healed, and he anointed his eyes with oils, with the mud. Jesus Christ is the Christ, and he's the anointed one. So he's anointed like Jesus was anointed. He washes in this pool that means sent from the sent one, and he finally says, I am. There's this close identification with Jesus. And even if we could call him such, he was an infinite Christ. Already this new creation is bearing the image of his creator. So here's what happens next. Verse 13, they, look at the verse, brought him to the Pharisees, the man who had been formerly blind. That was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. So the Pharisees again asked him how it was that he received his sight. And he said to them, well, he put mud on my eyes and I washed and I see. Some of the Pharisees says, well, this man was not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. Now, let me stop there and just say this really is the heart of the problem. Remember, Jesus is still working. Right there back in verse 4, he said he is working. This goes back to the created order that in 6 days God made the world and on the 7th day he rested. So they symbolically rested because they were trying to mirror the rest that is in God, but still it's not the 7th day yet. Jesus is still working. The 7th day is going to come after the resurrection when Jesus Christ enters his eternal rest and we ultimately go to enter into his rest. At this moment, they're still very much working. Of course, the Pharisees don't understand this. So look at verse 17. So they said to the blind man, what do you say about him since he has opened your eyes? He said, he is a prophet. So verse 18, the Jews did not believe that he had been blind and having received his sight. So they called his parents of the man who had received his sight. And asked them, is this your son who you say was born blind? How does he see? His parents answered, we know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but how he now sees we do not know. Nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he is of age. He will speak for himself. His parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be Christ, he's to be put out of the synagogue. That doesn't mean he was just taken out for the day, like an usher ushered him out. It just meant he was banned for life. The Pharisees put the word on the street, you follow Jesus Christ, you're excommunicated, you lose your faith. You have a public distancing and separation from your faith. It was incredibly humiliating. And so they interrogate He's interrogated by his neighbors, then he's interrogated by the Pharisees. So the Pharisees turn around, they interrogate the parents, and the parents say wisely, you just go ask him. They try to stay out of it. So this leads to this kind of climactic confrontation where they do just that. The Pharisees bring him back. Verse 24, so for the second time, they called the man who'd been born blind and said to him, give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. Now, what irony is there? They're invoking the name of God, but the Pharisees are denying the name of God. They're asking the man to give God glory, which is a way of saying, come clean, be honest. But at the same time, they fail to recognize John 1:14, that Jesus is the glory of God in the flesh. They're talking to a man who's born blind, and they're admitting that they cannot see it. Talk about jumping to conclusions. They begin with, look, we know he's a sinner, so we know this couldn't have happened. Verse 25, he answered, whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I know, though I was blind, now I see. And they said to him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? And he answered them, listen to this response. I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? It was like saying, hey, what are you, deaf? It's ironic coming from a guy who 10 minutes ago couldn't see, right? And most scholars really do think this is a rebuke. And some even go so far to say it's sarcasm, because that was his first question. Here's his second question. Look at the end of verse 27. Do you also want to become his disciples? Now, there's two ways to read this. One saying, oh, so you want to become his disciples? Like we would think sarcastically, but I don't know if I see that in the text. We don't really know. Obviously, we can't project emotion on him. It seems like this guy is just profoundly naive. Maybe saying, oh, so you want to get in on this? How do you think they receive this? Well, look at verse 29, verse 28. And they reviled him, saying, you are his disciples, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from. And after that reviling, this naive, freshly sight-given man who's just so full of excitement, has absolutely nothing to lose. This is the greatest day of his life. The man answered, verse 30, why, this is an amazing thing. It was literally a marvel. In fact, that word in the Greek was often attributed to a work of God. The man says, well, you know what? There's a miraculous thing. There's another miracle that's happened here. And listen to his logic, verse 30. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. Now, follow his logic. We know that God does not listen to sinners. But if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. And never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. What a shocking thing it is, scholars, PhDs, that here is someone who you don't even know, but he can't be a sinner because he's performing miracles, but he's performing miracles and you don't know him. What an isn't this hilarious, guys? How ironic. They didn't think it was that interesting. Verse 33, or verse 34, they answered him, you were born in utter sin, and you would teach us? Not only the anger of Jesus, they're just mean. It's a reference to his blindness. Your handicap, your limitation is attributed to sinfulness, and you're going to look at we're healthy. You're going to teach us? And they excommunicated him. They kicked him out of his own faith. Here's his final interrogation. Jesus, who sought him the first time, seeks him a second time. Verse 35, Jesus heard that they had cast him out. Having found him, said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Do you believe in the Son of Man? The word Son of Man was a word for God's judgment. Remember, we studied this before back from Daniel chapter 7. Jesus is given this title because it's a title that speaks of his ability to judge all people. And Jesus says to him, the key question of John, do you believe in the Son of Man? So he knows he can see. He's asking him if he's received spiritual sight. Verse 36, he answered, and who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? And Jesus said to him, watch this, you have seen him. Of course he has. Jesus opened his eyes. And it is he who is speaking to you. And he said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. Well, now I think we're getting closer to understanding what John was trying to teach us. That yes, there was a miracle, verses 1 through 7, but following that miracle was significant movement. So now think about it. These are the two big structural issues going on in these 6 scenes. The first one, miracle, he received sight. But then watch this progressive movement. It's mirrored here in verses 36 and 37 when he says, who is this, sir? And then he calls him Lord. In fact, it's the same word in Greek, kurios, but here has 2 different meanings. One, it was just a polite term of respect, sir, but then he calls him Lord. I'm recognizing you as Lord. A shift is taking place. And this shift was taking place all throughout the passage. Back in verse 11, he just said the man. And then in verse 17, he refers to him as a prophet. And then in verse 22, his parents acknowledge that he is the Christ. And then later on in verse 32, he says this man comes from God. And finally, in this final scene, he's calling him Lord. Now, listen very carefully. The miracle that Jesus worked on him is now creating movement inside him. The miracle that Jesus worked on him is now creating movement inside him. In other words, it was not enough for Jesus to give him spiritual sight, physical sight. Jesus gave him spiritual sight that progressively allowed him to ultimately see what was going on. And this is the big structure of the text. Jesus does a miracle upon him, but then there is movement inside of him. This is called a pronouncement miracle. Technically, that's what theologians would call it, a pronouncement miracle. Why? Well, because in performing this miracle, Jesus is announcing some big things about himself. 2 big things. He's announcing his way. That Jesus takes people who are not only incapable of seeing, but they can't even dream of what it might be like to have sight. And he goes into the human heart and he heals them. That's the way of Jesus. And I have every confidence in my mind Jesus wants to do that right now. You're hearing me right now. It has nothing to do with me or this church or this music. It's the Holy Spirit of Jesus Christ is saying to you, I want you to start seeing. I want to give you spiritual sight. I want to save you. And for some, the resistance has been the fact that we've been inoculated from true Christianity, and we've been inoculated by a form of it, which is going to church, being a good person, being related to people that are in church. And God wants you to move you out of that pretense of sight that's actually blindness, and He moves you to true spiritual sight. You need to be saved. You need to give your life to Christ. That's the way of Jesus. He takes blind people and allows them to see. That's His move upon us. But only the way of Jesus, this text is also pronouncing the work of Jesus. And the work of Jesus is so significant that when it gets into the human heart, it doesn't stop. This is the evidence of a genuine believer. The seed goes into the ground and it grows and it stays growing and it produces fruit. So the way of Jesus is that He does a miracle upon us, and the work of Jesus is that that miracle doesn't stop. It keeps growing and growing and growing until we come to full understanding that Jesus Christ is the Lord of our lives. In this case, it was a matter of minutes. For other people, it's years, where we're growing and maturing in our life. And so the question is, are you need the miracle of Jesus that He does upon us, giving us spiritual sight, allowing us to see, saving us? Are we in that second category where we've been born again, but at the same time, maybe for some reason, because we don't have the faith that God could do it, we've thwarted and aborted what God is doing is to bring us to full maturity? It's a phenomenal story, but actually it ends in a sad way. Here's the last part of the final scene. Look at verse 39. After He confesses Jesus Lord, Jesus has this commentary about His work, what He came to do. And Jesus said, "For judgment I came into this world, For those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind. Now, this is a strange statement. Jesus just came to liberate people. He's reacting against the judgment of the disciples when they were trying to judge this man for being born blind. Why does Jesus end? Why is John showing us Jesus ending this story for saying, for judgment I came into the world? Well, the judgment is not who we think it is upon. He says, for judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind. In other words, Jesus is going to take people who are spiritually blind, and he's going to turn the light on for them, allow them to see. But there's some who think they see, but they're rejecting Jesus. And Jesus says, my presence is not going to be liberating to them. My presence is actually going to be judgment upon them. Jesus, of course, was speaking to the Pharisees, and some were around. Look at how this ends, verse 40. Some of the Pharisees, they were near him, and they heard this as a rhetorical question, so they responded. They heard these things and said to him, wait a minute, are we also blind? And Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would have no guilt. Now that you say we see, your guilt remains. The evidence of the fact that you're truly blind, in other words, Jesus said, is the fact that you reject me, but say you truly see. So it doesn't matter who you are. The story illustrates how educated you are, how bright you are, what you've accomplished. If you reject the lordship of Jesus in your life, you're in darkness. It's as simple as that. You know, it's interesting. If you read through the Bible, anyone who's ever encountered the brightness and the light of God couldn't look. Remember in Exodus chapter 33, God shows Moses his glory, but it's to hide him in the cleft of the rock. Earlier, Exodus chapter 3, he sees the burning bush, but he can't look. I think of John in the book of Revelation who encounters the physical presence of Jesus as glowing like light, and same reaction, he can't look. Isaiah chapter 6, he's in the throne room of God. He can't look. And so in the same way, this blind man bows the knee and worships Jesus, which is evidence that he sees it. But not the Pharisees, and not maybe some of us who aren't on our knees looking up at Jesus, we're looking down on Jesus. But we still think to follow him, to bow the knee to him, to bend the heart to him, to make him the Lord of our lives is beneath us. So we're not looking up to him in worship, looking down on him in judgment. As the story ends, the blind man can see, and the Pharisees are simply blinded by the light. In the very presence of the light of the world, but they can't see it. They can't acknowledge that Jesus is who he says he is.